Case 1. Jatwan Cuffey. A school superintendent told the media the shooting started with bullying. The victim's own family said that was never true. This is the case of Jatwan Cuffey, convicted of killing 16-year-old Bobby McKeithen at a high school in Matthews, North Carolina. On the morning of October 29, 2018, before classes began at David W. Butler High School, 16-year-old Bobby McKeithen approached 16-year-old Jatwan Cuffey in a crowded hallway and struck him. Cuffey then produced a firearm and shot McKeithen. He fled the building briefly before returning and surrendering to a teacher on campus. McKeithen died from his injuries at the hospital shortly afterward. Students who witnessed the shooting described a chaotic scene as staff moved quickly to lock down the building and clear the hallway, with many students learning only later in the day that a classmate had died. Parents described a tense afternoon of waiting outside the school for updates, unsure at first whether their own children had been involved or harmed. Within hours of the shooting, Charlotte-Mecklenburg School Superintendent Dr. Clayton Wilcox told reporters that early reports suggested the conflict had begun with bullying that escalated, and that fear had led a student to bring a weapon to school. That statement spread nationally within the day, appearing in headlines across the country before investigators had completed even a preliminary review of the evidence. McKeithen's family strongly objected to the characterization. At a memorial gathering attended by hundreds of students and community members, a family advocate stated publicly that the claim had gone nationwide and that McKeithen was not a bully, describing him instead as a well-liked student who was mourned by an entire school community. Classmates who spoke afterward described McKeithen as someone who was friendly across different social groups and who was not known to target other students. The school district later clarified that the superintendent's comment referred to the broader pattern of events across the district that year, not an accusation against McKeithen specifically, but the family has said the initial damage to his reputation was difficult to undo once it had spread so widely across national television and online coverage. Law enforcement's investigation produced a different account than the initial bullying narrative. According to the arrest affidavit, Cuffey told a responding officer that the conflict had actually begun the previous day, stemming from a fight between several students in a nearby parking lot and a text message he considered taunting. He stated that he retrieved a firearm that had been hidden in a wooded area near the school before returning the following morning. Investigators pieced together the timeline, using surveillance footage from the school hallway, witness statements from students who saw the confrontation, and Cuffey's own statement following his arrest. The assistant district attorney assigned to the case stated that Cuffey did not claim to have been a victim of bullying or harassment prior to the incident, and that the evidence indicated he intended to injure, not necessarily kill, McKeithen. The case moved through the legal system over several months. Cuffey was initially charged as an adult with first-degree murder. A grand jury later reduced the charge to second-degree murder, and Cuffey was released on electronic monitoring pending trial in January 2019, a decision that drew criticism from the victim's family, who felt the release undermined the severity of the case and struggled to understand how a student accused of killing their son could return home while the case remained pending. McKeithen's mother told local reporters at the time that seeing Cuffey released, even under monitoring, felt like a second injustice on top of losing her son. In July 2019, Cuffey pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter. He was sentenced to a term of 80 to 108 months, meaning a minimum of approximately 6.5 years and a maximum of 9 years, with credit applied for time already served in custody. McKeithen's family publicly stated they felt the sentence did not reflect the severity of the loss, and they continued to push back on the bullying narrative that had shaped early public perception of the case. In statements following sentencing, family members said they felt they had lost their son twice, once to the shooting itself, and again to a public narrative that framed him as somehow responsible for his own death. They described the months following the shooting as a period of grieving complicated by having to publicly defend their son's character to strangers online who had only heard the initial, inaccurate version of events. The Cuffey case is frequently referenced not for a clean narrative of bullying leading to violence, but for the opposite reason. It demonstrates how an early, unverified statement from a school official can shape national media coverage before an investigation is complete. Journalists and legal commentators have since used the case as an example of the importance of waiting for confirmed investigative findings before assigning motive in a school violence case. The gap between the superintendent's early comment and the prosecutor's stated theory of the case remains one of the most studied aspects of the incident, and it has been cited in academic discussions of crisis communication in school districts following violent incidents. McKeithen's family has continued to advocate for stronger truth in early public statements following school violence incidents, arguing that inaccurate characterizations can cause lasting harm to a victim's reputation and complicate the grieving process for surviving family members. They have spoken at community events about the importance of allowing investigations to conclude before assigning responsibility for the circumstances of a violent death, and they have described their ongoing effort to make sure Bobby is remembered for who he actually was, not for the label that was attached to the case in its first news cycle. The case remains part of ongoing conversations in North Carolina regarding school safety protocols and how administrators communicate with the public in the immediate aftermath of a violent incident on campus, and it has prompted some districts to revise internal guidelines regarding what can be shared publicly before a formal investigation concludes. Case 2. Abel Cedeno. A history class erupted into a stabbing after objects were thrown across the room. One student did not survive, and the classroom would never be described the same way again. This is the case of Abel Cedeno, convicted of killing 15-year-old Matthew McCree inside a Bronx classroom. On September 27, 2017, during a United States history class at the Urban Assembly School for Wildlife Conservation in the Bronx, objects were thrown in the direction of 18-year-old Abel Cedeno by classmates. Following an exchange of words with 15-year-old Matthew McCree, Cedeno produced a knife he had purchased online and used it against McCree and a second student, 16-year-old Ariane LeBoy, who attempted to intervene. McCree died from his injuries. LeBoy survived after an extended hospitalization that included time in a coma, and his recovery required significant rehabilitation in the months that followed. Approximately 15 to 20 students in the classroom witnessed the incident, which was among the first homicides recorded inside a New York City public school in decades, and the school community was left shaken in the days that followed, with counselors brought in to support students and staff who had been present. Several students later described difficulty returning to that same classroom, and the school ultimately made changes to how the space was used going forward. At trial, Cedeno testified that he had experienced years of harassment related to his sexual orientation, and that he had brought the knife to school for personal protection rather than with intent to harm anyone. He stated he came to identify publicly as gay and bisexual following his arrest, and he described a childhood marked by instability and a lack of support at home, including time spent in foster care. However, Bronx District Attorney Darcel Clark addressed this directly at sentencing, stating that no evidence presented at trial showed that either McCree or LeBoy had ever bullied Cedeno. She stated that his reaction had caused lasting harm to multiple families, including his own, and emphasized that whatever difficulties Cedeno had faced in his life did not connect to the two students he targeted that day. Cedeno waived his right to a jury trial, and the case was heard by Bronx Supreme Court Justice Michael Gross over approximately 2 weeks. The prosecution presented testimony from the medical examiner regarding the injuries sustained by both victims, along with eyewitness accounts from students present in the classroom describing the sequence of events, including the moment objects were thrown and the confrontation that followed. In July 2019, Justice Gross found Cedeno guilty of first-degree manslaughter, first-degree assault, and criminal possession of a weapon. At sentencing in September 2019, Justice Gross declined to grant Cedeno youthful offender status, a designation that could have reduced the severity of his sentencing exposure. He was sentenced to 14 years for manslaughter and 8 years for assault, to be served concurrently, along with a term for the weapons charge and 5 years of post-release supervision. In his remarks, the judge acknowledged that Cedeno had described experiencing bullying in his past, but stated that this history did not excuse the outcome of that day in the classroom. Cedeno's legal team indicated an intention to appeal the verdict, and subsequent appellate review upheld the sentence as appropriate given the severity of the offense. Matthew McCree's family attended the trial throughout its duration and addressed the court at sentencing, describing a 15-year-old who had his whole life ahead of him and who had done nothing to provoke the attack against him. His mother spoke about learning of her son's death while he was still a student attending class, an ordinary school day that ended with a phone call no parent expects to receive. They spoke about the difficulty of returning to ordinary life knowing their son died in a place meant to be safe, surrounded by classmates and a teacher during an otherwise ordinary lesson. Ariane LeBoy and his family also addressed the physical and emotional toll of his recovery, describing months of medical treatment, physical therapy, and the lasting impact the injuries had on his daily life and his ability to return to a normal school routine. The case drew significant attention due to both the setting, a public school classroom in the middle of a lesson, and the questions it raised about how schools identify and respond to reports of bullying and harassment before a situation escalates. Advocacy organizations for LGBTQ students used the case to call for stronger anti-bullying protections in schools, while prosecutors maintained that the specific claim of bullying by the two victims was not supported by trial evidence. City education officials faced public questions in the aftermath about whether metal detectors or other screening measures could have prevented the knife from entering the building, prompting a broader review of weapons policies at the school. The Cedeno case remains a frequently cited example in discussions of school safety policy, weapons detection procedures, and the legal distinction between a defendant's personal history and a court's findings regarding a specific victim's conduct. Case 3. Noel Estevez. A 14-year-old returned to school for the first time in months and was involved in a fight that ended with a classmate's death before the first bell rang. This is the case of Noel Estevez, charged in the killing of 14-year-old Timothy Crump outside a Bronx middle school. On June 18, 2014, a physical altercation occurred outside a middle school in the Bronx between 14-year-old Noel Estevez and 14-year-old Timothy Crump, former friends whose relationship had deteriorated following a dispute over a missing cell phone. During the altercation, Estevez used a knife, and Crump sustained injuries from which he later died at a nearby hospital. Estevez remained at the scene and later provided a statement to police describing the events leading up to the incident. Neighbors in the surrounding community described the news of Crump's death spreading quickly through the neighborhood that morning, with many residents expressing disbelief that two boys who had once been close friends were now at the center of a homicide investigation. Students who knew both boys described them as having been nearly inseparable earlier in their friendship, which made the outcome especially difficult for classmates to process. According to his account to investigators, Crump struck him repeatedly before the incident occurred. Estevez's attorney stated publicly that his client had experienced months of harassment from Crump and others, including repeated confrontations near his home, property damage, and threats, to the degree that Estevez had stopped attending school altogether in the months prior and had unsuccessfully sought a transfer to another school for his safety. The attorney stated that the day of the incident marked Estevez's first day back at school after this extended absence, framing the case as the culmination of a long period of fear that had gone unaddressed by the school system. Estevez's family described watching him withdraw during that period, saying he had become anxious and reluctant to leave the house, and that they had repeatedly sought help from the school without feeling their concerns were fully addressed. This account was partially examined by the New York City Special Commissioner of Investigation for Schools, whose office conducted an independent review involving interviews with approximately 20 staff members at the school. The resulting report stated that investigators did not find substantial evidence that Estevez had been bullied while on school property, while noting this did not rule out the possibility that conflict between the two boys had occurred elsewhere, away from campus. Crump's family and members of the surrounding community described him in a different light than the bullying allegations suggested, characterizing him as well-liked among his peers and expressing frustration that his reputation had been shaped so heavily by claims made after his death when he was no longer able to respond to them himself. Crump's mother spoke publicly about the pain of hearing her son described as an aggressor in news coverage, saying it added a second layer of grief on top of losing him. Estevez was initially charged as an adult with second-degree murder and first-degree manslaughter and held without bail while the case proceeded. He testified before a Bronx grand jury regarding the circumstances of the incident. In July 2014, the grand jury returned an indictment on the reduced charge of second-degree manslaughter, and the case was transferred out of adult criminal court and into family court, where it proceeded as a juvenile matter. Because family court proceedings involving a juvenile defendant are closed to the public and their records are sealed under New York law, no public information is available regarding the final resolution of Estevez's case, including whether the matter proceeded to a fact-finding hearing or a plea agreement, or what disposition, if any, was ultimately ordered by the court. Public reporting on the case effectively ends with his indictment and transfer to family court in the summer of 2014, leaving both families and the broader public without a publicly confirmed resolution to the case. For Crump's family in particular, this has meant living with an outcome they have never been able to fully see through to a public conclusion. The Estevez case is frequently cited in discussions of how the juvenile justice system in New York handles serious offenses committed by defendants under the age of 16, particularly the balance between public accountability and the confidentiality protections built into the family court system. It also remains a reference point in conversations about how schools evaluate and respond to reports of bullying that a student claims occurred primarily outside of school property, where documentation and staff observation are inherently limited, and where two families are left to carry very different accounts of the same relationship without a final public record to settle the matter. Case 4. Brandon McInerney. A classroom of students watched a 14-year-old shoot a 15-year-old classmate twice, over conflict that had been building for weeks. This is the case of Brandon McInerney, convicted in the killing of Lawrence King at a junior high school in Oxnard, California. On the morning of February 12, 2008, 14-year-old Brandon McInerney brought a handgun to Yo Green Junior High School. During a first-period computer lab class, he approached 15-year-old Lawrence King, seated at a nearby desk, and shot him twice. King was taken off life support 2 days later, on Valentine's Day, a detail that drew significant attention given the timing so close to the holiday. There was no dispute during the legal proceedings that McInerney fired the shots that caused King's death. The classroom was full of students at the time, several of whom later provided testimony describing the moments before and after the shooting, including the confusion and panic that followed as teachers rushed to clear the room. King, an 8th-grade student, had in the weeks before his death begun wearing makeup and other gender non-conforming clothing to school, a shift that classmates and staff noticed and that had become a subject of conversation among students. Friends of King later described him as someone who had recently found the confidence to express himself more openly, despite knowing it drew attention and, at times, ridicule from other students. Defense attorneys argued that King had directed repeated unwanted attention toward McInerney, including comments made in front of classmates, and that this contributed to an escalating conflict between the two students in the days leading up to the shooting. A teacher who had observed some of these interactions later testified that, in hindsight, they resembled a form of harassment. Prosecutors presented a different theory, introducing evidence including drawings containing hate symbols recovered in connection with McInerney, and testimony from a classmate stating that McInerney had indicated in advance that he intended to bring a weapon to school. Prosecutors argued the shooting reflected premeditation tied to bias against King's gender expression rather than a response to provocation. McInerney was charged as an adult with first-degree murder along with a hate crime enhancement and a firearm enhancement, exposing him to a sentence of life in prison if convicted as charged. Due to significant local media coverage, the trial was moved to a different courthouse outside the community where the shooting occurred. The trial before Judge Charles Campbell lasted approximately 9 weeks in 2011 and included extensive testimony from classmates, school staff, and mental health professionals regarding both boys' backgrounds. In September 2011, the jury was unable to reach a unanimous verdict, and the court declared a mistrial. Several jurors stated afterward that they had reservations about trying a 14-year-old defendant as an adult, and some expressed sympathy for the defense's account of the relationship between the two boys, a reaction that drew criticism from advocacy groups who felt it reflected bias against King based on his gender expression rather than an objective evaluation of the evidence. Rather than proceed to a second trial, McInerney entered a guilty plea in November 2011 to second-degree murder, voluntary manslaughter, and a firearm use charge. In December 2011, he was sentenced to 21 years in prison, the maximum term available under the terms of the plea agreement, combining the sentence for manslaughter with an additional term for the firearm enhancement. Lawrence King's family attended the proceedings and spoke about the loss of a 14-year-old who was in the process of expressing his identity openly for the first time when his life was cut short. They described King as someone who had shown courage in being open about who he was at a young age, in an environment that was not always accepting, and they expressed frustration that some public discussion of the case focused more on King's behavior than on the fact that a classmate had brought a loaded weapon to school with the stated intention of using it. King's family has said that watching parts of the community rally around McInerney during the trial, including jurors who publicly expressed sympathy for him, added a painful layer to an already difficult loss. Community members and advocacy groups held vigils in the aftermath of the shooting, and the case became a rallying point for conversations about protections for gender nonconforming students in schools nationwide, with King's name invoked for years afterward in discussions of school safety for LGBTQ youth. The case prompted broader legal and legislative discussion regarding the use of a defendant's claims about a victim's gender identity or sexual orientation as a mitigating factor in a criminal trial. California subsequently passed legislation restricting the use of this type of defense strategy in the state's courts, a development frequently linked to public reaction following the McInerney trial. The King case remains one of the most referenced examples in discussions of school-based violence connected to a student's gender identity, and it continues to inform training and policy conversations among educators regarding early intervention when conflict between students begins to escalate. For classrooms and hallways. For ordinary school days that ended with a courtroom instead of a graduation. If these cases stayed with you, subscribe and turn on notifications. We cover a new case every single week.